Hey everyone, Dr. Bodle here, and today we're going to be talking about the carnivore diet and whether or not it can be helpful for people with Hashimoto's. Now, this isn't going to be a totally comprehensive video on all the ins and outs of the carnivore diet. There are plenty of other videos out there that do just that. But if you've been looking into it and wondering about how it might interact with your thyroid function and specifically your immune function and Hashimoto's, this video is for you. I know it can be hard as individuals whenever we're starting a new diet to determine whether we need to double down and keep going, even if things are a little bit rocky in the beginning, or if we should change up our strategy. So I wanted to give you a bit of a bird's eye view from what we're seeing clinically and working with many different patients who are utilizing the carnivore diet. That way, if you do decide to use this nutritional strategy, you can approach it in a way that's practical and sensible. And don't forget, before we get started here, if you've been enjoying the content and like learning about natural strategies to support your Hashimoto's and hypothyroid symptoms, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't done so, and click the bell for new videos every Thursday. So when it comes to supporting Hashimoto's and thyroid-related symptoms for any one individual patient, I'm always asking myself in the workup, what sort of things are triggering their immune system and how can we better manage them? And while there's a wide array of different immune triggers, two of the main ones that I find myself working on with the vast majority of my patients includes any individual food sensitivities or food reactions, and also working to improve glycemic control or blood sugar stability. An example of a food reaction that can cause problems for people with Hashimoto's would be eating gluten. Gluten is a complex protein that's found in wheat, barley, and rye, and in general, it can be a little bit more difficult for the human body to break it down. However, when it comes to Hashimoto's, some of the molecular characteristics of gluten are similar to the proteins and enzymes that are found in our thyroid gland. Therefore, restricting gluten or any other food sensitivities that an individual might have can help our immune system to function more normally and reduce some of the damage that's occurring. When it comes to glycemic control, what we're talking about here is fluctuations in our blood sugar, either high or low, that are significant enough to cause an inflammatory stress on the body. When this happens, if there are other systems that are already unstable, and with Hashimoto's we know that our immune system isn't working properly, it can perpetuate an internal environment that is unhealthy and prevent us from recovering. The classic thing that I like to cite is people noticing changes in how they feel and function when it comes to their meal timing. Meaning that if you go too long without eating, you start to notice an increase in headaches, irritability, shaking, anxiety, and fatigue. And those symptoms tend to be resolved after you eat. Or on the flip side, when you do eat, you feel tired and lethargic afterwards. You have more brain fog, and your function goes down in general. Again, if our fuel levels are not stable, and again, whether that's high or low, we can see symptoms that are associated with that. And when we change our fuel intake by eating something, that's what highlights those symptoms the most. And if you're interested in learning more about how blood sugar can affect your immune function and Hashimoto's, I think this is a big deal because a lot of practitioners don't talk about it. I have a bunch of videos on it because I do think it's important, and I will make sure to link one of those for you in the cards above. But with these two principles, food reactions and blood sugar control, we want to make sure that any strategy we're applying to them fits and makes sense and is going to help us to manage them in a better way. The thing about carnivore is that it is a great fit for both of these things. Carnivore is the ultimate elimination diet, and I would even call it an advanced form of AIP. Plus, the significant reduction in carbohydrates in combination with the increase in fats and proteins that tend to be a bit more stable fuel for us can play a big role in helping us to manage and stabilize our blood sugar. Now, of course, these aren't going to be the main triggers for everyone with Hashimoto's. Everyone with Hashimoto's is going to be a little bit different, and we have to focus on different aspects of your health. That's why these things can be a little confusing, and it's also why I try to provide a bunch of different options for you guys. That way you can apply the ones that make the most sense for you. But if these are areas that you're trying to manage and get a better handle on, then carnivore becomes more of a reasonable option for us. And at the very least, it's something that we can consider. But if we are going to apply a strategy, we need to have an idea of what that strategy looks like. And one of my issues with carnivore is there's not a lot of agreements on exactly what it is. Now, I don't care too much for labels, and I don't really care how you eat as long as it's making you feel good and it makes you happy. And I think some of the fighting that goes on about what is and isn't contained within any particular diet is a little bit silly. Plus, it makes it really confusing for the individual as they're trying to make changes. It reminds me a little bit of one time I had a patient come in who told me that they were vegan, but they eat fish sometimes. And I was like, that's great. I mean, I have no problem with you eating fish, but I wouldn't really call that being a vegan. Now, when it comes to carnivore, you'll see everything from, well, carnivore is only animal products. Or maybe carnivore is zero carb. Or even carnivore is mostly meat-based, but every once in a while it's okay to have fruit. Now, I don't say this to anger anyone, and I know there are people out there who have staunch beliefs on what carnivore is. But we should also be aware that these things are out there. And for people who are new to changing their nutrition, they're going to see all of it, and that's where a lot of that confusion comes from. But as I said, I don't care as much about what we call it. I'm more concerned with the impact that it has on our physiology. So let's look at how two different approaches to carnivore could have different implications for how our immune system and Hashimoto's responds. And just to interject here, hopefully this isn't making things more confusing. I'm just trying to cover as much of the breadth of knowledge and information as we can. That way you can work through it for yourself. But let's say for an individual that their version of carnivore is any food that is an animal or is made by an animal. So of course that'll include things like meat and fish, but it'll also include things like honey, milk, cheese, and eggs. Now, is there anything wrong with that? I don't know. It might work perfectly well for that person. However, we also have to recognize that when it comes to Hashimoto's, dairy can be a problem for some people. And so by having a carnivore diet that includes that, it becomes less of that more intense elimination diet, and we might not receive the same benefits or results that we were expecting to. Again, if you're following that kind of approach and it's working well, I'm on board, I support you. I just want us to be aware of the fact that it's not going to be a good fit for everyone. The other quirk that I threw in there was the inclusion of honey. Now, honey is a product of bees, so some people consider that to be carnivore, and it's something that I love to include as part of my nutrition plan. But honey is still sugar, albeit a natural version of it. And is this going to be a good option for everyone, especially those people who are trying to improve their blood sugar control? Of course, the answer is going to come down to the individual, but you can see how things can get a little fuzzy here. Now, I know there are probably people out there who are likely yelling at me about this, saying, no way, honey is not carnivore. But you do see it come up on certain people's lists. So this is why I'm so adamant about us detaching ourselves from the philosophical construct of carnivore and instead focusing on what our body needs and what works for us. And as I've said in other videos, the same could be applied for any diet. The last thing that I wanted to note in regards to carnivore being the ultimate elimination diet is something that I think is agreed upon in all different carnivore camps, and that is the reduction in fiber. Now, I've made a video on this topic as well, but just to kind of briefly summarize, fiber is always promoted as being a universal good, but in my opinion, the research isn't conclusive, and what I've seen clinically is that not everyone does better with more fiber. Of course, for some people, especially those coming from a highly processed diet, you throw a little fiber their way and they do great. So I'm not saying that it's all bad. But fiber, by its very nature, is not broken down by our gut, and it can be an irritant and has been associated with irritable bowel conditions and some of our more inflammatory bowel conditions. So it's always an interesting thing when someone realizes, you know what, when I'm having those more fibrous foods, I feel worse, and when I pull them out, I tend to feel better, which is something that usually goes against what we've all been told for the entirety of our lives. This is another reason why for some people, when they do adopt a more whole foods diet or a more paleo style diet, they can feel worse. The paleo style diet is going to almost inherently have a higher level of fiber compared to their processed food diet. And for those of you with a sensitive digestive tract, having that extra fiber isn't always a good thing. This is where I think carnivore can be a revelation for a lot of people. Whenever we have GI issues, whether they're related to thyroid problems or not, the standard of care is almost always to increase your fiber. And when we do the exact opposite of that and completely eliminate our fiber intake, some people will notice immediate and dramatic improvements in how they feel and how their gut is responding. So instead of thinking of fiber as a universal good, I always tell my patients that it's more like a dial that we can turn up or down depending on how our gut tolerates it. And for some people, turning it all the way down to zero can take some of that pressure off and be extremely beneficial. So yes, carnivore can be the ultimate elimination diet, and it can be really helpful for a lot of people with Hashimoto's. It can eliminate fiber intake. It can eliminate a lot of those food triggers and food allergens, and it can help us to modulate our blood sugar. But as we also know, different approaches are going to include different factors that may or may not work for you. So we have to make sure to finesse it in the right way for your physiology. This next thing that I wanted to address is this idea of low carb diets leading to low T3 levels. Are there research papers that show this? Yes, there are. Is carnivore typically a very low or zero carbohydrate diet? Yes, it is. So is it something that we should be aware of? Absolutely, but there are a few caveats here. First of all, and this probably doesn't surprise you, but the research is a little all over the place. This is a niche topic, so there isn't a ton of papers out there, and when the research is done, they usually don't have a huge sample size, so it's not always clear if the results are something that we can really take to the bank. The other thing is that even in those research studies that do show a decrease in T3, it doesn't always equate to a change in function or how the patient is feeling. In fact, one paper states that although there was a significant difference in T3 levels when comparing a high carb diet to a low carb diet, there was no significant difference in resting metabolic rate. This has led some to hypothesize that because of the change in carbs, maybe there's a change in thyroid physiology that we don't really understand yet, and although the absolute quantity or levels of T3 are different, maybe the system overall could be functioning the same or possibly better. But the thing that I want us to be careful to avoid, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we look at nutrient deficiencies, is I don't want people to become so tied to their nutrition and identity that they'll start to justify some of these results in a way that supports what they're already doing. It sort of reminds me of when there's an athlete on a rival sports team, and when they're on the rival sports team, everything they do is bad and, ill-intentioned and all that stuff. But if they get traded to your team, oh, well, suddenly all of that's justified and it's okay because, they're playing for us now. It's okay to have those biases, especially with athletics, because that's just fun. But we want to be aware of them and aware that they exist. But as with any lab value, I don't find them to be particularly valuable. I don't find a lab value to be particularly valuable unless we look at it in the context of your function. A lab value is a static number on a page. Your function is what matters to us most at the end of the day. So if you do adopt a carnivore or other low carb diet and you see your T3 levels start to drop, and you're also noticing symptoms that are associated with a decrease in metabolism, you're feeling cold all the time, your energy is worse, you're losing hair, your digestion slows down and you're feeling more bloated, anything like that, I think any of those are a sign that your function isn't responding well and we should look at making some changes. And just to tack on one more thing when it comes to low T3 levels, which may or may not be related, but the other area that we can see low T3 levels is when our calorie intake gets too low. Now in the carnivore world, we might be able to get away with that because of where we're getting our calories from. And people can eat a very high protein, high fat diet and feel very satiated and not have any negative impacts on their energy levels, sleep, or endurance. But at the same time, because that type of approach can be so satiating and it can naturally reduce the amount of calories that we're eating, which for some people is the main goal, at the same time, and as we said before, we have to be aware that it can potentially impact our T3 levels, But also, we're seeing in some women that it can have a negative impact on sex hormone function. Now, as always, it depends. And for some people, adopting a carnivore diet and reducing some of the inflammation associated with our immune system and gut can really help to promote better sex hormone function. But as I've said in other videos, sex hormones are an expensive part of our physiology. And if we're not fueling our body appropriately, then we can start to have problems in these areas. So whether it's being cold and tired all the time, or noticing changes in your menstrual cycle and hormonally related symptoms, be willing to recognize that and also be willing to adjust some of those nutritional dials to prevent things from getting worse. Whether it's carnivore or any other diet, although they can be supportive, although they can be the right fit, sometimes doing that diet harder or taking it to the most extreme level isn't always the answer. And in the case with T3 and some of these sex hormone changes, for some people, when tolerated, sometimes just bumping up the carbohydrate intake can be a good solution. Next on our list of things to discuss is nutrient deficiencies. And a lot of people ask, well, if I'm going to adopt a diet that is primarily meat-based, aren't there going to be certain nutrients that I miss out on? Unfortunately, this is another area where we don't really know, but hey, that's nutrition in general. But anecdotally speaking, we do see people who are following carnivore for weeks, months, years, or decades, and they don't seem to be having any issues with nutrient deficiencies. The big one that often comes up is vitamin C, and lack of vitamin C can lead to scurvy. Now, you can get vitamin C from a number of animal products, including raw liver, eggs, and fish roe. And there are discussions over whether muscle meat does contain enough vitamin C to offset scurvy. Now, if you look at the standard guidelines, they'll say that muscle meat doesn't have any vitamin C. But we do know that some is present, and historically speaking, fresh meat has been a solution for people who have been dealing with scurvy. Now, is this a situation where we're bending some of the facts to justify our approach? I don't know. And I'm not sure if the fact that the carnivore diet is so low in carbohydrates that it changes some of the game in terms of our overall vitamin C demands. But again, we do see people having success, so it might not be as big of an issue as we once thought. The other thing that concerned internet articles will bring up when it comes to carnivore is not necessarily the lack of other nutrients, but rather the lack of flavonoids that we can get from plants, which are the main antioxidant components, and also the lack of fiber. But otherwise, the vast majority of key nutrients that we need as part of our diet come from animal products. They don't come from plant products. And things like retinol, heme-based iron, vitamin B12, DHA, and EPA are all things that we need to be more careful about on a vegetarian or vegan diet, but aren't an issue when we're including these animal products. The other thing that I would note here is that if your gut is inflamed, it's going to be very hard for you to absorb nutrients anyway. And if carnivore is what allows your gut to calm down and function more normally, then it's going to give you a huge advantage in terms of what you can bring into your system. So although people might squabble about the exact amount of nutrients that they're getting, we also have to consider our body's ability to break down that food and then absorb it properly. You know, some people like to throw around that phrase that you're not what you eat, rather you are what you absorb. And I do think there's some truth to that. And finally, my last thoughts on nutrient deficiencies and carnivore have no basis in research, and usually I try to give you guys a very well thought out and reasonable explanation, but this one might be a little bit more flippant. And that is, it drives me nuts when people bring this up and their background is a very processed food diet. There is no way that you're going to have worse nutrient deficiencies after a month of test driving carnivore, even if you pick out like all the little bad things about it that you can, when you compare that to someone who is, like eating Cocoa Puffs every morning. In my mind, these things are just, they're not even in the same universe, and it's silly to think that, one could potentially be a problem when as a society we've accepted that all of these processed foods are totally fine, even if they're fortified with vitamins and minerals. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to make sure to cover, which is especially important for people with thyroid issues and changes in their metabolic rate, is that even though carnivore in general can help us to eat less, people can still overeat. Part of this issue is due to the lifestyle that many of us live these days. And because of long work hours, disruptions in sleep, and for the most part, consuming a fairly processed diet, I think our signals for satiety tend to be more broken, and it can be hard to recognize when we've eaten enough. The other issue is that you'll see a lot of carnivore advocates promoting the idea that you don't need to count calories. And what I think we need to understand here is that calories still matter. But what the advocates are counting on is that this higher protein, higher fat diet will be so satiating that there will be a natural shutoff to where we can't overeat too many calories. But we humans are clever, and if there's a will, there's a way. I've seen a number of patients, both in practice and through online testimonials, where they'll talk about consuming maybe 4,000 or 5,000 calories per day, but they're continuing to lead a fairly sedentary lifestyle, and they have a significant amount of body weight that they're trying to lose in the first place. So even though I freely admit and support the fact that there is a different hormonal and metabolic impact that healthy fats and protein have on our metabolism when compared to processed carbohydrates and processed fats, we still don't want to take things to the extreme. Some people get so attached to this idea that if it fits within my diet paradigm, then it must be safe for me. But just about anything can be distorted to the point where it fits, but that doesn't mean that it's good. I've used the example before of all the products that you'll see at the grocery store these days that are labeled keto. Is that keto cookie a good option for you? I have no idea. But the merits of that cookie should be judged on the actual nutritional content and, as we keep repeating, how it makes you feel. The labeling on the front of the package really doesn't have much to do with any of that. Same thing goes in the carnivore world. Some people are going to do better with more fat, some people are going to do better with less. But artificially adding tons of butter or lard to an already fatty steak probably isn't a great choice for someone who's already dealing with weight issues and isn't very active in general. Again, I'm not saying fat is bad, and for some people it can have some real noticeable impacts on their hunger and energy levels. But we want to be reasonable about what that intake looks like. So in summary, carnivore, just like many of these other diets, can be a useful tool when applied appropriately. Carnivore eliminates a huge amount of potential food allergens and fiber, and by reducing stress on our gut, it can help to support better immune function. Additionally, carnivore can have a significant impact on blood glucose and related markers through its restriction of dietary carbohydrates. Although there is some concern around nutrient deficiencies, it's likely that managing GI inflammation can actually help to improve nutrient absorption, and there's enough anecdotal evidence of people having success that this likely isn't a problem. While I do like to use carnivore with patients, I typically employ it when they have these specific areas that need support and they haven't seen improvements with some of the initial dietary changes that they've made. In general, I do want people to have a flexible and dynamic metabolism, so although I'm very supportive to people who are utilizing carnivore for the long term if they feel well with it, more often than not, I'm using carnivore as a bit of a reset or restart for patients where they'll follow the plan for about 2 to 3 months, and then we'll reassess and determine if we want to add foods back in. But feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Is carnivore crazy? Is it something you love? I know when I was first exposed to it, it seemed completely out there, but the more that I got used to the idea, the more it made sense, and the more it's been a helpful tool for us to use with certain patients. If you like this video but need more help and want someone to assess your immune triggers and provide you with a sensible nutrition plan that'll help you to achieve your goals, you can send me an email to contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com, and once we hear from you, my staff will reach out and see if you're interested in setting up a free consultation. During the consultation, you and I will discuss your health, your goals, and see if we're a good fit to work together. It's absolutely no pressure, and a lot of people feel much better after going through the process. If you'd rather keep learning on your own, you can grab either one of my free downloads linked in the description box, or you can check out any of the other videos on the channel. But that's all for this week's video. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for all the questions, and feel free to reach out if there's anything else you need. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and follow me on social media for daily information and strategies. But my name is Dr. Brad Bodle. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in the next one.